history in nationalism. We have four presentations, but there's a change to the running order. Ian Stewart will start us off, and then we will have Bastian Willems is coming in for a second presentation. Lorenzo Possocco will be doing the third presentation, as is on the list, and Joe Schuldt will be coming in to give the final presentation. So we will still have four presentations in the hour. That means there's 15 minutes allocated to each, and I'm going to be a strict time top so that we have enough time for some questions afterwards. So without further ado, it's 2 minutes past 2, can we start with Ian Stewart, who is going to give us a presentation on pan-nationalisms, particularly in Ireland in 1900.
Right, thank you. Just a disclaimer, I'm a historian first, and sometimes I like to moonlight as a sort of sociologist, so this might be a bit different from what we've had earlier. So, as we all know, the field of nationalism studies is broad, varied, and uneven. While spectacular strides have been made in individual case studies and in the general understanding of what nationalism is and how it functions, the question, when was the nation, still receives an inordinate amount of attention, as we heard this morning. Yet, despite all the theorizing, there remain considerable aspects of nationalism that are unexplored. And one such area is the subject of my paper, Pan-nationalisms. So looking through what could be called the canon of nationalism studies, it becomes quickly obvious that pan-nationalism features little. Anthony Smith, John Bruley, and Montserrat Coibanot all touch upon the subject, but only fleetingly and in reference to individual movements rather than as a general discussion of the phenomenon. Louis Snyder wrote the one book called Macro-Nationalisms, A History of the Pan-Movements, that takes pan-nationalism as its focus, though it offers a survey of individual movements without delving very deeply into their ideas and motivations. It's pretty dated now as well. Pan-Slavism and especially Pan-Germanism have had entire books devoted to them, and some of these are some of the earliest historical studies of nationalism. Pan-Africanism features frequently in more general works because it's a pretty intriguing manifestation of diaspora nationalism. But myriad other pan-nationalist movements have existed, including Pan-Latinism, Pan-Americanism, Pan-Turkism, and Pan-Celticism, which is the focus of my research, and it's been almost completely neglected by scholars. So pan-nationalisms, like all nationalisms, are incredibly multifaceted and differ greatly from one another. It would be impossible to give a general framework in a paper of this length, so instead I outline some ideas and then present a case study of Pan-Celticism and use it as a comparator with which to draw some wider conclusions. If we start from Anthony Smith's declaration that, quote, from a strictly political standpoint, it must be judged that all pan-nationalisms are a failure, end quote, this paper will set out to answer the questions of, one, in the Pan-Celtic case, whether this is true, and two, if so, why have Pan-Celticism and pan-nationalism more generally proved so ineffectual? Were the pan-nationalisms of the early 20th century mere flashes in the pan, or did they have more long-lasting effects? So I know definitions and labels are a problem, but I'll try and give some guidelines anyway. Job Leersen calls pan-nationalist movements the nationalism of language families, while Louis Snyder defined pan-movements as, quote, political cultural movements seeking to enhance and promote the solidarity of peoples bound together by common or kindred language, cultural similarities, the same historical traditions, and or geographical proximity. And this could be sort of any standard definition of nationalism. So I think both of these are partially correct, but perhaps two of the most salient aspects of pan-nationalist movements that these two authors seem to overlook are, one, the extent to which race is relied upon by pan-nationalists, and two, that in many cases, pan-nationalist movements transcend political and religious boundaries, which is actually more rare for nationalist movements than it may first seem. And here I also want to draw a crucial distinction between pan-nationalisms and what have been called unification nationalisms. And the difference here is that unification nationalisms are most often promoted by states, while pan-nationalist movements, I think, are more from the grassroots. So here I would point to the state-sponsored nationalism of Bismarckian Germany or Garibaldi in Italy as examples of unification nationalism, and the pan-Germanism of the pressure group, the Pan-German League, which called for unity of Germanic peoples and militant imperialist expansion as pan-nationalism. And so while the Pan-German League may have had some influential members in the government, it was never institutionalized in a state-backed organization. So here's an incredibly brief survey of some of the pan-nationalist movements that I want to look at. And it's what is generally considered the earliest pan-national movement was the Pan-Slavic movement, which originated in Central Europe during the mid-19th century, with the first Pan-Slavic conference held in Prague in 1848. The early pan-nationalists idealized the past as a time when all Slavs were one and equal, but the movement factionalized under the stress of competing national loyalties. Russia came to harbor the strongest Pan-Slavic movement, which became essentially a Russian chauvinist and Orthodox movement. Pan-Germanism was similar to the Russian Pan-Slavic movement in that it was an outward-looking form of extreme German nationalism, seeking to assimilate all Germanic nations. Pan-Germanism's most powerful group was the Pan-German League, which existed from 1891 to 1939 and attracted tens of thousands of members. Its policies were influential in the evolution of Nazi ideology. And then another one is Pan-Africanism, which emerged at the end of the 19th century, amongst intellectuals stressing the cultural and historical legacies of Africans, united against slavery and colonialism. Obviously it didn't possess a state, but it gathered strength in the 20th century anyway. So for these pan-nationalisms circa 1900, race was the most common unifying element. Though language was the most obvious manifestation of similarity between peoples, few national, let alone pan-national movements had a common language. For those pan-nationalisms without a common language, race could function as the unifying essence around which the pan-national identity was constructed. It was therefore a central concept for, among others, the Pan-Celts, the Pan-Slavs, and Pan-Africans. But the concept of race was ubiquitous across Europe, with the rise of scientific racialism seeping into and underpinning nationalist discourses. So even in the case of the Pan-Germans, for whom language was less problematic, the Pan-German League's stated purpose was to, quote, quicken the national sentiment of all Germans, and in particular to awaken and foster the sense of racial and cultural kinship of all sections of the German people. And alongside, and in many cases assisting racialized thinking, was the rise of philology. And philology was a boon to pan-nationalist movements in particular, as it allowed languages to be traced back to a common root. So it's not a far step to make to view those with related languages as the same kinship. So Pan-Slavism began in the Central European context under the influence of the Brothers Grimm. And the term Pan-Slavism was first used by a Slovak philologist, Jan Herkel, in 1826, who was studying under the Brothers Grimm, before it was appropriated in the later 19th century by the more overt racialist thinking of the anti-Western Slavophiles in Russia. And philology also provided the keystone for Pan-Celtic thought in 1854, when the German philologist Johann Caspar Seuss adopted the comparative methodology of Jacob Grimm's Deutsche Grammatik for use in his landmark philological work on Celtic languages, Grammatica Celtica. Though earlier works in Britain and France had stressed the common root of the Celtic tongues, Seuss demonstrated most persuasively that the Celtic languages extended from the same Indo-European root, thereby, quote, asserting the internal unity of the Celtic family, according to the Irish philologist John O'Donovan. Seuss's work established a base which Celtic scholars and revivalists could build upon, and oftentimes the Celtic scholars were the Celtic revivalists. So here's the case study of Pan-Celticism. In 1900, the first year that the first Pan-African Conference was held in London, also saw the formation of the Celtic Association in Dublin. Although Pan-Celtic overtures had been sounded from multiple directions over the course of the 19th century, the Celtic Association was the first organization where Pan-Celticism was instituted as the official operating principle. It was founded by an English physicist and member of the Gaelic League named Edmund Edward Fournier Dub, who recruited a liberal unionist peer, Lord Castletown, to act as president. So Fournier provided much of the direction of the movement, while Castletown bankrolled much of it. The association also featured, at various times, many of the leading Celtic revivalists, including Yeats, Lady Gregory, George Russell, at some time or other Patrick Pearse and Douglas Hyde, and then also Patrick Geddes, Sir John Rhys, François Jaffrenu, and the leading German Celtic philologists Kuno Meyer, Ernst Windisch, and Heinrich Zimmer. So over the course of its life, from 1900 to about 1912, the association worked to connect the nationalist movements of the disparate Celtic nations. It did this by hosting pan-Celtic congresses in 1901 in Dublin, in 1904 at Carnarvon, and 1907 in Edinburgh, and also a series of smaller events in Ireland. The association also published a monthly magazine called Celtia, which served as a makeshift public sphere. In its first issue, Celtia proclaimed that it would be, quote, the organ of militant Celticism, directed mainly against the deadening and demoralizing influences of modern Anglo-Saxondom, and working to raise the self-respect and strengthen the cohesion of the Celtic race. So, in its first issue, it laid out its three main ideas, which were a Celtic racial exceptionalism, the links between language and race, and a glorious utopian future. And race was obviously, like for some of the other movements, the ontological root of pan-Celticism. Like the other cultural nationalist movements in Ireland, though, it relied on ethnic historicism for its legitimacy, and the concept of race provided the ultimate grounding for that idea. Through the common racial kernel, or ethne, pan-Celticism constituted a decentralized nationalism to which all the Celtic nations could turn. But race was intimately linked to language. Echoing Herder, Celtia declared language to be the, quote, strongest bonds between the nations. Much of the relationship between race and language can be revealed by this map of Celtia, the imagined pan-Celtic community. So Celtia was identified as those nations that still possessed a living Celtic language: Ireland, Wales, Brittany, the Isle of Man, and the Highlands. While Cornwall was initially ostracized because Cornish as a language was thought to be dead, the lowlands of Scotland were excluded for racial purposes due to their, quote, largely Teutonic blood. So you can kind of see some of the links between race and language here. The overwhelming majority of Celtia editorials concerned the revival of native Celtic languages, but the diversity of languages presented a particular problem, as very few pan-Celts could understand more than one Celtic language. English and French were the main languages used, and the Pan-Slavs actually suffered a similar problem, which meant that German was most often its lingua franca. So to get around the implied cultural hegemony of English and French, from 1902, Esperanto was actually muted as a language to connect the Celtic nations, and it wouldn't have any of the imperialist baggage of English or French. So, but in addition to connecting the Celtic nations, Esperanto would also serve to connect this sort of league of small nations, which was this global federation that Fournier envisioned. Like some contemporary British commentators who argued for an Anglo-Saxon imperial confederation, Fournier's idea was modeled on the United States. But in stark contrast to the ideas of Greater Britain, anti-imperialism was the raison d'etre of Fournier's confederation. According to him, the principles of individual liberty stemming from the French Revolution have been extended to people in Western European countries, but imperial powers forbade their extension to the realm of international relations. To defeat imperialism, there would need to be a federation of small nation-states that would challenge the great powers, and this would be made up of the Celtic Federation of Nations, the Balkans, Scandinavia, and various Central and South American countries. And scientific progress, particularly the advent of air power, would, in Fournier's opinion, ensure this international democracy of nations because it would mean that the potential for violence would be democratized, thereby inevitably leading to decentralization and disarmament. He didn't consider any of the material realities of the situation, ignoring the fact that the imperial powers also had the greatest manufacturing capacities and technological capabilities. And so this was a utopian solution drawn more from H.G. Wells and Jules Verne than it was from the actual situation in Ireland. So while pan-Celticism certainly contributed to the milieu of cultural nationalist Ireland and advanced language movements amongst the Celtic countries, particularly in Cornwall and Wales, ultimately it failed on its own terms, spectacularly. Although it had set the bar for itself extremely high, no nationalist movement has achieved an international utopia, far from it. In the pan-Celtic case, Anthony Smith's statements about pan-nationalisms being a political failure is true. In the political sphere, pan-Celticism's only attempted involvement was on the Third Republic of government of Émile Combes in 1902 and 1903, which engaged in a campaign of language suppression in Brittany, and the Celtic Association had little impact here. But pan-Celticism was a cultural nationalist movement intentionally avoiding politics. In fact, most pan-nationalist movements are cultural nationalists, so commenting on their political impotence misses the point. But even despite the often non-political nature of pan-nationalisms, I would still argue that in the general case of pan-nationalisms, Smith's statement is still false. Pan-Slavism was invoked by Stalin in the 1940s in order to unite the USSR against the Nazis, who themselves owed a large debt to the biological racism and expansionist ambitions embedded in the ideology of pan-Germanism. Similar to pan-Celticism, the pan-Slavs had a romantic goal of a federation of free Slavic nations. And in some senses, Yugoslavia was a very real manifestation of a subset of pan-Slavic thought. However, the ultimate fate of Yugoslavia also reveals a major reason why pan-nationalisms have struggled. The strength of individual nationalisms are much stronger than any imagined pan-national unity. Pan-Celticism was strongly opposed by the chauvinism of the Gaelic movement in Ireland, and the national problem is itself linked to a problem already identified as a reason for the weakness of pan-nationalisms, the lack of state sponsorship. Nevertheless, all of these movements deserve more careful consideration in nationalism studies and in the history of nationalism, and I think pan-Celticism belongs in that reassessment. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So, yes, I hope you can all see it. We get to that in a little bit. So, on June 20, 2015, so just over a week from now, Germany will inaugurate a new national holiday, the Remembrance Day for victims of flight and expulsion. So driving force behind this holiday is a large number of German refugees and ex-police and their descendants. So the wave of German civilians that had to flee or was expelled between 1944 and 1949 from East Prussia, Germany's easternmost province, and the focus of this paper comprised of some 2 million men, women and children. Most of them ended up in what was to become Western Germany, was above all in Schleswig-Holstein and North Rhine-Westphalia. They quickly established unions and newspapers, of which the purpose appeared to be the conservation of their heritage. Their sentiments, although at first sight innocent in shape, not only tackled the feelings of Heimweh, that's homesickness, and Sehnsucht, longing, but actually formed the foundation for radical dismissal of the Soviet power that had taken over the lands they used to inhabit. This paper will argue that the refugees, although their search for a regional identity, became the forerunners of the anti-Soviet movement founded in Germany and later in the entire Western sphere of influence. The recollections were uncritically used as evidence of bestial Soviet behavior, and so far their newspapers have not been critically looked at in regard to German national consciousness. Yet as we will see, whereas nationalism has long been frowned upon in post-war Germany, East Prussians actively searched for their own identity, which was subsequently used by national policymakers to set up larger agendas. So, quickly to this map over here. We now know this, of course, as Germany. I focus on the area completely on the right, which used to be Germany, but you might not recognize it because it really, as of now, is not part of what we think is Germany. Germany, of course, used to be much, much larger, and the most easternmost province there in the far right corner is East Prussia, which is the focus of this paper. So, accusations of appalling behavior of Soviet soldiers in the first post-war period are abundant. That the Soviet advance into Germany was accompanied by arson, plunder and rape is undeniable, but as historians now argue, many armies acted horrible before then and since, and the uniqueness of these events in between 1944 and 1948 has become open to dispute in the last years. Yet, they have long been considered as to be unique in regard to the scale of it. In the first post-war years, the West German government actually founded a ministry, the Federal Ministry of Displaced Persons, Refugees and War Victims. And this ministry established a commission headed by Theodor Schieder to map the events surrounding the expulsion and flight. This culminated in 1955 in a book called The Documentation of the Expulsion of Germans from Central and Eastern Europe in the years 1945 to 1948. The work immediately became a cornerstone of German memory culture and has been cited innumerable times, often as proof for bestial Soviet conduct. So similarly, a number of refugee newspapers spawned in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, among them the Ostpreußen Warte, Wir Ostpreußen, Ostpreußische Nachrichten, and the Ostpreußen Blatt. The Ostpreußen Blatt still exists today. The three others existed for 11 years at most. So, what these newspapers and the work of Schida have in common is that their editors all have roots in Nazism. Time-wise, this of course makes perfect sense. Schida was 44 when he got the task of composing the work, which made him 25 when the National Socialists came to power in 1933. The first years of his career were thus formed by strong National Socialist influences. Without discussing every individual editor-in-chief of the above-mentioned newspapers, suffice it to say that also they made their first professional steps during their 12 years of National Socialist rule. This leaves the question to what extent these men embraced National Socialist values. Schida has been exposed as a radical Nazi, as he played a central role in providing a pseudo-scientific basis for the extermination of racial minorities along the line of social Darwinism at the Albertina University in Königsberg, which is the capital of East Prussia. As the tone in the newspapers is remarkably similar to Schida's edited work, one becomes aware of their eventual hidden agendas when it comes to defining their regional identity, which was their self-proclaimed main task of these newspapers. So, as we all know, like various prominent scholars within nationalism studies, such as Jenkins and Macron, to name but two, have established that defining oneself means defining the other. So this is what actively happened in the refugees newspapers, and the way it happened is rather particular, I feel. These newspapers show a recurrent feature, rather than merely depending on an editorial office. They have the tendency actually of placing stories from the readers themselves. Many of these stories were recorded memories and had as such no news value whatsoever. But they had the benefit of coming off as authentic and relatable. So these stories repeated the same themes over and over. The cold winter of 1945 and the irresponsible behavior of Nazi party official in regard to the evacuation of the population. The idea this was put forward that East Prussia civilians were victims actually of Nazism, rather than active participants of a war of annihilation. So, favorite topic, based on the number of publications, was the way that the province changed under Soviet rule. So, again, this province actually became part of Russia. It's now still in Russian hands. It's Oblast Kaliningrad. And well, it's an area which we really don't know too much about. It's just above what we now know as Poland and just under Lithuania. So, although this is like seemingly innocent, the way that it's being portrayed, like the newspapers were filled with pictures and articles of an idyllic East Prussia, a province of dark forests, crystal seas, elks, storks, beach resorts, and medieval churches. So here's the first picture of the Wir Ostpreußen, and you see like this is the church of Königsberg. So this is the Schloss, so the castle of Königsberg, and they would very often do this, like show this kind of pictures on the first page, which I always think is rather particular for a newspaper. They did rather often. So these ideas, these idyllic ideas were cultivated. So these dark forests, these animals, they were cultivated, bred, protected, and built by Germans, but they were now neglected and underappreciated by the Soviets. So between the lines, it was clear that the fear felt for like what they called like Soviet hordes that engulfed Germany in 1944, 1945, that these fears had been justified. And their worst predictions as such came true. They were exactly the barbarians that everyone knew that they were. So again, also in the summer of 1945, a famine swept through East Prussia, and this famine continued well into 1946, with even like recurrent reports of cannibalism and so on and so forth. So a pretty intense famine. So this, the refugees argued, was due to the Soviet administration, and that during the war, for example, German troops had rid the Soviet Union, of which this province is now just a part, for most of its goods, and that the Russian children throughout the entire Russia were still dying in 1950 as a result of massive, like, scorched earth politics that was no part of their analysis. Similarly, the Soviets were accused of not being able to get the agrarian sector back into gear, which had existed in the years before the Soviet takeover. So that East Prussian soil was sandy, was known to, well, every farmer from East Prussia, and most people know that the province had long depended on different costly government initiatives in the house-standing before, just to stay afloat. So the agriculture in East Prussia has always been rather unsuccessful, but maintained nevertheless. So after the war, in that light of tough decisions that had to be made by the Soviet government, this area, of course, did not receive this kind of report, but that these were a result of, like, very tough choices that had to be made by the Soviet government that was just simply overlooked. And that during the war, the agriculture in the province was run on a massive slave labor system, consisting of, well, again, these same Soviets, that was even quicker forgotten. So any nuance in this way of portraying it was absent. So for me, it is striking to see how similar the tone of these newspapers are in comparison to National Socialist propaganda. The Soviets are time and again portrayed as incapable and inferior. The only clear difference is that they lack like racial stereotyping, although this can partly at least be explained by the extensive denazification efforts and the initial control of the German press by the occupying Allied forces. So the purpose of this ever-hardening tone in these kind of newspapers was never a secret. They formed the main platform that lobbied for a return of the province to Germany, a movement that remained very strong throughout the 1950s. So, despite some vague election promises, no Western German government ever intended to burn its fingers on the matter of reunification of East Prussia with the rest of Germany. Yet these experiences of these refugees soon became part, actually, of German national consciousness, and were actively used to grow closer to the US and to Britain, while they were similarly served to distance Western Germany from the Soviet Union. These Prussians were the only ones that could compare a European society to a Soviet one, as they had first-hand experience with both. In this sense, they were unique in Western Europe, especially as the events of the Holocaust were still hardly researched at this time. This would only start in the 1960s. Their insight served as a useful bargaining chip, even though this insight was radicalized and reminiscent of National Socialist themes. Their accounts were the first post-war propagandic ammunition against the Soviets, and fitted supranational ideas that could, for example, be observed at NATO. This observation leaves, for me at least, a bad taste in my mouth. There's basically a thinly veiled Nazi rhetoric that still managed to define parts of European political agenda. Still today, many of us see Russians as inferior, rather than as a superpower that could only be halted by the full force of America and its Western allies. So, as a conclusion, the need for a search for regional identity was deeply felt among the refugees and ex-police from East Prussia, especially as this group was completely open. So we should not forget, going back to the picture over here, there was no German still living here by 1948, 1949. Like, literally everyone was expelled. There no German remained. So the entire conversation, like the entire arguments took place mainly here. So the way they went about it was by defining the other, which was now inhabiting their place of birth, which was the Russian. The tone of their argument was strongly reminiscent of National Socialist propaganda, and the conclusions they reached were without exception based on parroted stereotypes. Unfortunately for these Prussians, their cause were hardly taken serious, and they did not at all lead to what they hoped to achieve, which was a reunification of the province with Germany. Their plight was all but ignored. Yet it was not the search for themselves that caught the attention, but their definition of the other that was copied. The practical examples of German fear and Russian barbarity were eagerly used to forge a strong anti-Soviet sentiment throughout the West. And as this paper has sought to show, the questionable origin of these East Prussian arguments contributed to the early Cold War polarization without offering a worthwhile contribution to the East Prussian cause itself. Thank you.
Get into it. So I've examined The Gathering, which was an Irish tourism campaign which took place in 2013. After I looked into it and did a little bit of research on it, I've come making the bold statement that it can be seen as an act of symbolic violence that legitimated and continues to legitimate exclusive orthodox versions of Irishness and Irish national identity. Tourism is one of the largest, if not the largest industry in the world, and it's no different within the national context of Ireland. Ireland, in terms of Irish tourism, it's really no different in many respects to tourism in other nations around the world. However, what does make it unique is the Irish diaspora itself. One important thing to go on is that the Irish Constitution in Article 2, expresses that it says the Irish nation cherishes its special affinity with people of Irish ancestry living abroad and who share its cultural heritage and identity. Going on from there, as Sean said, I'm working with a concept that I'm calling the fraternal other. It's kind of an amalgamation of other forms of otherness or other definitions of types of otherness. So I'll go with the Irish diaspora would qualify as a fraternal other on the grounds that it has a contributing influence on the identity of the in-group, Irish nationals within Ireland. However, unlike with significant others, there is no perceived threat from the diaspora or the fraternal other per se. The diaspora are analog or analogous, to use Thomas Erickson's term, in that they are almost like ourselves, yet they're marked by perceived kinship rooted in collective memory and genealogy. However, the diaspora by and large belong to different nations, thus constituting their otherness. I say that the fraternal aspect of their otherness is similar to that of fraternal twins. They share origins, bloodlines, and other characteristics, but are nonetheless two distinct individuals, or in this case, abstract entities. Now, going along this idea of collective memory, what goes part and parcel with it is the power to dictate, label, and nominate. There are a proliferation of symbols that the world happens to recognize as distinctly Irish, and I do use that term in quotes. Everything from being a redhead to shamrocks to leprechauns, you know, the harp, Guinness, St. Patrick, the list can go on and on, really. The important aspect to remember about this is the way that symbols are both important for a national identity in general and for tourism. There is a difference between signs and signs and symbols. I don't have time to go into that. Yet it's also the way symbols make it possible for the diaspora and the Irish within Ireland to think of themselves as one and the same in theory. Here's just a couple other symbols: Gaelic football, hurling, Guinness, everyone knows this, shamrock, and then this one has a particular Celtic flair to it. Moving on, UCD professor Tom Inglis has said that the Irish diaspora are one of, if not the most important, contemporary markers of Irish national identity, even more so than the traditional markers, which would be the Irish language, the GAA, Catholicism, etc., etc. By virtue of emigration and its century-old legacy, subsequently a habitus of being Irish has spread throughout the globe. Now, it's in order to understand how 70 million people, which is how much they say comprises the diaspora, living outside Ireland can be considered part of the Irish nation, that I turn to Pierre Bourdieu. By utilizing Bourdieu, we are able to explain the way in which ideas, and in this case identities, come to fruition, secure a position within the subjective and objective structures within society. We are able to also examine the way said ideas reproduce themselves, aid in group formation, and act as inclusionary and exclusionary. Now I'm going to give two definitions straight from Bourdieu. Please bear with me because they are kind of long-winded and a little difficult to follow. The first one would be a symbolic capital, which is, as it says, any property, any form of capital, whether physical, economic, cultural, or social, when it is perceived by social agents endowed with categories of perception, which cause them to know it and to recognize it, to give it value. This last sentence here, the recognition and the value of it, is probably the most important aspect, in my opinion, of this definition. Then we turn to a second concept, which is actually the main idea behind this paper, which is known as symbolic violence. Now, this violence which extorts submission, which is not perceived as such, based on collective expectations or socially inculcated beliefs. Like the theory of magic, the theory of symbolic violence rests on a theory of belief, or more precisely, on a theory of the production of belief, of the work of socialization necessary to reproduce agents endowed with the schemes of perception, an appreciation that will permit them to perceive and obey the injunctions inscribed in a situation or discourse. Okay, so again, this violence is not actual violence and it's not perceived as such. It's legitimated and grounded in supposed normalcy and taken as the way things are, which then creates a cycle known as doxa. I will go ahead and give one more strict definition there. Now, this doxa is a particular point of view, the point of view of the dominant, this is key, which presents and imposes itself as a universal point of view, the point of view of those who dominate by dominating the state and who have constituted their point of view as universal by constituting the state. So, again, if we're going to take the viewpoint that the Irish diaspora is a unique identity marker of Irishness and that it is discursively constructed, only to become part of the tourism field, we can easily assess the Gathering 2013. The Gathering has been described as Ireland's largest tourism initiative ever and been dubbed the People's Project. It was a year-long tourism campaign in which 5,000 events were held across the entire island, which also includes Northern Ireland. And it called upon the local communities and organizations to help bring in tourists from the diaspora specifically. Economically speaking, it was successful, bringing in an approximate profit of €170 million. However, according to Mary Hickman, Irish Studies, or more specifically Irish Diaspora Studies scholar, it appears, at least in official discourses, that Ireland's relationship with the Irish diaspora is primarily perceived as a basis for the commodification of Irishness. Unofficially, however, the Gathering exemplifies the doxa and misrecognition within the tourism field, to use Bourdieu's term. As mentioned above, the Gathering was hailed as the People's Project, in which much of the event coordination was delegated at the local community level and put on the people to bring the diaspora home. However, while the Gathering's final report, the government report, indicates that this did have much to do with the success of the event, the idea of the People's Project is actually also contradicted within the same report. One is the use of state-sponsored media to reach the majority of the diaspora, most notably the 40 million Irish Americans who comprise over half of the diaspora and were an explicit target of the campaign. Everything from social media to traditional advertisements, both print and digital, were utilized to promote the campaign and have been hailed as the true reason of the success. And an estimated equivalent advertising value of €115 million is what aided the campaign. Secondly, the state's tourist agencies had the final say in which events were to be part of the diaspora. A registration form was provided by said agencies, and based on the belief of a community's event to bring in potential tourists, determine whether the event was included or not. These two examples indicate the state's ability to nominate and determine what is legitimate via their symbolic capital, which in this case was accumulated through an immense amount of economic capital and to a lesser extent cultural and social capital. The state, just to sum it up on the theory part real quick, the state amasses an overall amount of capital, which then gives it what Bourdieu calls symbolic capital. This leaves them with a monopolization over the codification of culture and what they deem legitimate. What they're essentially there will say what is Irish and what is not Irish at the end of the day. In sum, the state shapes the mental structures of the people via nomination, which eventually becomes embodied by the people, and this actually represents the aforementioned doxa. Now, I'm going to skip over something and I'm going to move on to some images which will hopefully make everything I said a little bit clearer. Can't promise it, but we can try. So here, we have a seemingly simple, benign advertisement, yet it is anything but. Firstly and foremost, look at the proliferation of green. It screams Irish. Whether green is the national color of Ireland or not, because blue has been argued as historically actually the national color, is besides the point. Green is what is recognized by the tourists and most notably the diaspora, and for the diaspora it's what has meaning as Irish. Secondly, the three circular designs actually have a nuanced Celtic flair to them. Taken individually, they can be viewed as Celtic art, with the right bottom image being a sunburst, a very common and popular symbol during the Celtic revival. If we view the circles together, they form a Celtic triangle and also a shamrock. It also represents prehistoric art, such as that found at the famous tourist site of Newgrange. Through this symbol, the Irish of a Celtic people is manifested. This symbol is able to express something as abstract as the nation, to which the Irish diaspora will feel attached. It also looks like fireworks, implying the celebration of the gathering. Lastly, the poster bluntly says 70 million Irish people. This signifies the collective memory of emigration and allows all successive generations of immigrants to share in the past, present, and future of Ireland. Going on to figure 2, we have an image from the Dingle Peninsula in County Kerry, Ireland. This stereotypical image of the rugged landscape associated with the West, from the untamed brush to the stone wall to the cottage, to the sun beaming across the ocean, this presents an evocative image of what Ireland is truly like. An unassuming location, it represents the Ireland envisaged by Eamon de Valera, as well as in many poems, plays, and paintings. The depiction of Ireland in terms of a pre-modern idol for visitors, and by implication for the Irish too, is one of the most consistently reoccurring themes of the nation's tourist imagery. Moving on to figure 3. This image may not offer 1,000 welcomes, or words for that matter, but it does say a lot. Firstly, we have welcome home as bold and exclaimed. This directly keeps in line with the theme of the gathering, namely to bring the diaspora home. It plays into the rhetoric that the Irish diaspora are an unequivocal part of the Irish nation, even when said members are actually part of another nation. This brings me to the second point, that these Irish nationals are actually American, and notably, they are white Americans. The hats that the gentlemen are wearing are Navy or Naval Academy hats, and they've come to partake in the Emerald Isle Classic versus Notre Dame, an important American football game which is played in Ireland. This again suggests a strong connection between America and Ireland. Thirdly, is by virtue of these people being featured and the fact that they're attending a sporting event in a different country, let alone just simply traveling, that we can assume them to have sufficient economic capital. If we hold these 3 assessments as true, we see one collective memory at play in them being welcomed home. We see a white genealogical, i.e. exclusive or ethnic national identity being presented as Irish. And we see a progression from a poor peasant society to one that can boast of social mobility and advancement via these prosperous people. If we go to figure 4, and this happens to be my favorite one here. It's quite a mixture of the previous examples. Once again, we have the famous Irish landscape in the background. But while it's not as important in this image as in figure 2, it nonetheless depicts what the state has allowed Ireland to be viewed as. Like figure 3, we once again have a white ethnic blood-type depiction of what being Irish constitutes. As well, these 2 men also presumably have sufficient economic capital. However, what is different in this figure than the others is the directly indirect advertising to Americans. Invite home Uncle Sam acts as the signifier, while the Irish Americans are the signified. As is common knowledge, Uncle Sam is a nickname for the U.S., more specifically the U.S. government. To add weight to this analysis, look at how "and first cousin Todd" is written much smaller and put into parentheses. Additionally, these two people represent stereotypes of American tourists. Both have a toothy smile with very white teeth and a tan. The young man has sun-bleached fair hair and is combed across, and the old man has a baseball hat, a dark jacket, and light trousers. He looks like a golfer, and he probably has a polo shirt too. So, we'll move on to, how am I doing on time, Sean?
You have 2 minutes.
Oh, all right, we'll get this done. Like figure 5, like figure 2, utilizes the landscape to evoke the memory of what Ireland is truly like. It is a very broody photo, sharpened by being in black and white. It also has a solemn message of loss. I think you can maybe read it. It says, many, many years ago they gathered as this white star, line ticket office, to leave our shores forever. And then below it says, may their children's children gather on our decks to see it once again. As an explicit message to those of the diaspora, it once more signifies the collective memory of emigration. Once more, by conjuring this memory, it puts an emphasis on blood ties as necessary to being Irish. I had a little bit more to say about it, but I'm going to move on. This is the last image, and this is what we'll close on here. It's actually taken from one of the promotional videos, so it's not a still image in its original form. And it was actually a part of the Redhead Convention, which was one of the many events of the gathering itself. As Amanda III points out, in Anglo cultures, redheadedness is associated with Celticness in general, but is more so viewed as inherently Irish above all else. While Third writes about the female redhead as a subjugated other, it is clear that the state has taken this colonial viewpoint and flipped it on its head. For an understanding that there's a mystique about being a redhead, the image taps into the uniqueness of the Irish as a nation and garners both symbolic and economic capital through being the one true home of all redheads in rhetoric. However, this redheadedness once more promotes the idea of a nation throughout the globe, but one that is nonetheless white. So, just with one quick closing remark, we see that through the gathering, and if we view it as an act of symbolic violence, it leads us to, question where we're at in contemporary Ireland and what it means to be Irish and who is excluded and who is excluded and for what reasons. Thank you.
Can I ask the four presenters to come up here and take a seat? My job is just to field the questions. I'm not here as a discussant, but I have to say I'm heartened by the presentations, and in some way all four are linked by examining the issues of national identity and nationalism by looking at it in the margins, or looking at in unusual places, whether you're looking at as it were reopening the issue of Irish nationalism by looking at pan-Celticism, reopening the long trawled over, overly examined study of German Nazism, but doing so by looking at East Prussian identity, or then looking at the kind of what we might see as quite banal practices in institutions, whether it's tourist marketing or whether it's museums that we pass by every day, and looking at how they form part of the machinery that helps generate and produce particular kind of identities. I think that the focus of the four papers on these off the beaten track or away from the mainstream of nationalist political parties, nationalist discourse, and the stuff that I think has become a little bit tired is for me at least very refreshing. So we have a good 15, maybe even up to 20 minutes to take some questions. So would anybody like to ask a question? Yes, please.
Thanks very much for the papers, they're all very interesting. And my first question is for the first paper. The Celtia magazine, I'm very interested in that, and I was just wondering if you could tell me a bit more about that. And in a vague way. Okay. And the last paper, Joe, I was just, I remember when that advertising campaign started, and I was repeatedly embarrassed and mortified at it, because I was wondering about the, I understand from talking to you earlier that it was a very successful campaign, but I was wondering of the play between that and Plastic Paddy.
You want want to go first? Do you want me to?
Okay.
Just from a superficial understanding of plastic patty in the general way that people understand it, plastic patty, in case you don't know, is kind of like a fake Irishman. You know, Americans get called a plastic patty a lot, but there's also Irish people that get called a plastic patty. I don't have a wealth of knowledge on that specifically, but you know, and I also, when I was looking at the research, when I was looking at it, obviously I looked at it from more of a state aspect. There was a lot of backlash. Economically, as I said, it was successful, but there has been a lot of backlash. You know, Gabriel Byrne, which is, you're aware of who he is, he's spoken out quite harshly against it. In terms of plastic pattiness, though, it would be something to kind of do some more research and connect it to more thoroughly.
There's also the term West Brit.
Okay, I actually don't know that one. So, all right.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Celtia is sort of, like I said, the makeshift public sphere for this association, because it does connect people from all the different Celtic nations and philologists on the continent and in America. It runs from 1901 to 1905, goes under, and then again from 1907 to 1908. And you see how important it is, because when it's gone, Pan-Celticism really ebbs. And I mean, it goes under again in 1908, and then the whole thing sort of dies after that. But it's the really interesting guy is Fournier Dow, and it's his sort of pet project. And he writes all the editorials and slags everyone off and everything. But there aren't many copies of it, but it's in the NLI.
How is it financed? Subscription?
Yeah, there's subscriptions, but I mean, Castletown bankrolls most of it.
Okay, thank you.
Ask Ian.
I have a question for Lorenzo. Would you say there's a shift in the narrative since you argue that Turkey is trying to establish itself different from Europe and from the Arabic countries? Would there be a visible shift since the obvious dead end of EU accession for Turkey? Since I seem to see a discourse there where it's like, okay, we're obviously not part of the EU, we need to redefine ourselves. Do you think that's part of it?
Yes, yes, I think well, there is also this part. I mean, this Turkish Islamic synthesis is it goes back in time in the 80s with Turgut Özal, Türk Islam synthesis. But in my opinion, it increased very much in the recent 5 years. So yes, in that sense, yes, because with the European rejection of Turkey, then yes, I remember the president saying we can do it without Europe. We don't need Europe, and that was also an answer, you know, to the rejection, to European rejection. So yes.
Hola. Yourself?
Hi. My question is for you, Joe. I'm wondering if you see some of the themes that you talked about for the gathering also coming through in the Decade of Centenary celebrations. And I can give you a little bit of background. I have a Decade of Centenaries IRC grant to develop a mobile walking tour of the Easter Rising. I manage 5 students who are doing that, and they're constantly arguing over how the Rising should be portrayed. Which is what brought me here today. So it's a really interesting issue, and your talk touched on that. So I'm just curious what your opinions are.
You know, there's a lot of, I'm glad you're doing research on it, because there's a lot of people talking about it right now. It's something that I would be interested in. I don't have more than a superficial knowledge of it at this moment, but I would definitely say that there are many links, many similarities that are going on. I do know a friend that was working, she did a master's and she did a research on Moore Street, and it actually originally had nothing to do with nationalism in any way, shape, or form, and then it ended up, you know, there's a monument over there, if I'm not mistaken, and a lot of the way that monument and for the celebration that's coming up is affecting the way businesses and who owns businesses over there on Moore Street currently. So I would definitely see some links going on, and it would be something I'd be interested in looking at. So.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. Yourself first, and then you.
Actually, I have 2 questions. One, what I also placed in the paper, so that area was actually divided between the Soviet Union and Poland, and you talked about the image of the Russian and the Soviets. But I'm curious whether in those newspapers there was also a discussion on the Poles, and also the Poles who arrived in Allenstein, Olsztyn, and Elbląg, came actually were themselves refugees coming from the lost areas of Poland. So I wonder if that appeared, if their image was different from the Russians, and if their experience of being refugees and occupying the house of the Germans appeared there. And then one for Lorenzo. So this Gallipoli is not only a birthplace of modern Turkey. Some argue it's also for New Zealand and Australia. It's the essential moment of nation building. So I wonder if in that museum, or in the museum in Çanakkale, the town, considering also the amount of visitors from New Zealand and Australia, if that's played and if that's brought also as part of the narrative, as opposed to the British conglomerate and the British hegemonic.
No, well, they say, they talk, I mean, the narrative talks about it, but it doesn't really deepen the subject. So it's mostly about the Ottoman Empire. It's about the birth of modern Turkey. I mean, at least in this Kabatape simulation center. And in fact, I mean, I visited the museum many times, and the first time I visited it was in 2012. That's how I had the idea of working on it. And I remember visitors from New Zealand being shocked by the narrative, because they wouldn't expect, because the narrative really shows the British and the Anzacs actually as fools. It is really strong. I couldn't show you the clip, unfortunately, but it is really a strong narrative. So they would get, like, they wouldn't actually expect something like that. But on the other side, there are different narrations too. But there is the message of peace too. But yes, that's it.
Good, as for your question, the views of the Poles portrayed in these kind of newspapers is similarly, is very strongly negative. But the main focus is on this northern part, which is like now Russian. It's in Russian hands, and the German ex-police, they considered the Russians, or like what we call now like the Soviets, to be like the reason that they're gone actually. So like the Russians, they entered violently. They started like raping, like setting things on fire and so on and so forth. And so like in their narrative, as portrayed in the 1950s at least, it's the Russians that like are like the reason for their current situation. And the way that the Poles are portrayed, like what you said, like in Olsztyn, which is like Allenstein, which is a little bit to the south. This is more like, well, I wouldn't say like, let's say a little bit more nuanced, because like the Poles are in turn also like an effect of like politics which they disagreed with. So in that respect they share like a similar fate, like also like Polish borders moved, and so also these Poles have been shifted around. But then again, the Poles in turn actually got German land just east of what is now Germany. So this used to be Germany as well. So like their view of the Poles is, it's, let's say, a little bit more diverse. I wouldn't say necessarily positive, but where the Russians are consistently portrayed as like barbaric, the Poles have a little bit more like a diverse view. Yet not a positive, but let's say diverse. And a big difference is also you couldn't answer the Kaliningrad Oblast, so this northern part was absolutely impossible for any Westerner to get to, whereas sometimes you will hear stories about Germans being able to look at this area from Poland or from Lithuania. So sometimes they managed to escape, for example, to Lithuania, for example, as partisans, or what is called as Wolfskinder, which are like small kids who are like sent by their parents up north, just hoping to, you know, like to survive actually. So you have like some Wolfskinder coming from Lithuania or from Poland. So like there are some people from these areas like returning, and their story is a more nuanced one. So and the stories from this area, the Kaliningrad Oblast, are like only negative. Like it's the Russians doing all the evil, and there's not much more to it for them at this point.
Okay. Yourself, you have a question?
I have a question to Lorenzo. Mine is quite similar to kind of Özge's question. Actually, in Turkish national identity, Ottoman past has been perceived as the other, as a negative other actually. And the War of Çanakkale was always presented as the rupture from the Ottoman past, the collapse of the Ottoman past, and the rebirth of the nation. So do you think, is there a change in the narrative during the AKP government that's kind of a continuity with the Ottoman past, or presented as a difference, as a rupture, as always has been?
Okay, I have to ask you in which past, because there are different narratives and different layers in Turkish history. So
the collapse period, probably.
because I mean, you know, during Kemalism, the state. Kemalists attempted to omit Ottoman history, and posing the birth of the nation in Central Anatolia. Then with the multi-party system in 1950, things changed. They opened to it. There was a relaxation, and narratives were rediscovered. And then once again in the 80s, were still again rediscovered, and they could introduce also the late empire period, which was before omitted, because it was a decadent period. It was the period of the decadence of the empire. It was not glorious at all, because the Ottoman Empire lost slowly its territory. In my opinion, yes, it's a switch, it's a shift in national narrations, and I believe that these new museums are actually are playing a very important role in providing this new identity. In Istanbul, many museums have been restored, rebuilt completely. So if you think that the AKP has the power, is it that power now? This is the 13 years power, so it's a long time. Journalists start to speak about Erdoganism. Yes, I think it's a big change, and there is a big change in national narratives in Turkey.
Okay, look, so that we can get some refreshment without putting the whole show significantly behind. If you have any more questions, we can take them over coffee, but for now, can we give everybody a round of applause?